Welcome, everyone. This is the 14th Annual Agroforestry Symposium, and we are so delighted that you all are here. Our theme this year is demystifying perennial crop improvement and integration. And this morning's session, I think, will be a really wonderful foundation for us to build on throughout the day as we learn from a really incredible lineup of presenters. My name is Hannah Himmelgarn. I'm the Assistant Program Director here at the Center for Agroforestry, and I'd like to begin with a few acknowledgements. First, I work and live in a place we know colonially as Columbia, Missouri, which is home of the University of Missouri's Central Mizzou campus. MU, as a land-grant university, is set up to provide readily available research-based programs and educational resources to improve the lives of the people who live here. And this symposium is an example of that. But none of this would be possible without the land itself, granted to this institution through the 1862 Morrill Act. The Morrill Act redistributed the wealth built upon this land for thousands of years by the indigenous stewards of this place. And the violent removals of these people and the ongoing ramifications of colonization is an important part of our story here together that we need to know in order to heal. At the Center for Agroforestry, we work with native trees and shrubs whose presence here can be attributed in part to those traditional indigenous practices that sustained these savannas and woodlands and forests for millennia. So acknowledging the long history here in tending these plants is particularly salient for us and for this event. So we are honored to be working now with members of Osage Nation towards mending some of those connections. The Osage, along with other descendants of Dagiha speaking peoples and the Oto-Missouri, the Alaini, and Iowa, all carry important ancestral ties to this place. And for the last few hundred years, those who've arrived here as settlers, as slaves, as immigrants and refugees have also informed the path of the landscape. And here we are, imagining what's next together. Because we're in a virtual space with participants from all over the world, at this point, I'd like to direct you to a map that was developed by a group called Native Land Digital. They're a not-for-profit Indigenous-led group in Canada, and their interactive app is one of the best single sites I've seen that is continuously being updated to visualize Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties on a global map. So please take some time to check that out and consider the story of the land where you are. I also want to acknowledge and share gratitude for the groups who've supported this event, including MU's College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources, Greenland's Blue Waters, the Nature Conservancy, Forest Keeling Nursery, the Sand County Foundation, Elemental Enzymes, Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native, and the USDA North Central Sustainable Ag Research and Education Group. Gratitude also for my coworkers at the Center for Agroforestry, Mallory Daly, Kelsey Stubblefield, Caroline Todd, and Ron Ravord. They've all helped piece together this event, along with some of our partners in the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute, who contributed to the development of the theme and the program for this year's symposium. We'll hear more about the Biology Integration Institute shortly from Dr. Allison Miller, who is the principal investigator on that project. All right, let's get rolling. At this point, I am honored to introduce the Center for Agroforestry's Interim Director, Dr. Ben Knapp, to share a few words about who we are and why we're here.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be here and be joined by so many people who are coming from a lot of places for the symposium this morning. My name is Ben Knapp, and I'm stepping in as the interim director for the Center of Agroforestry after Dr. Sarah Lovell recently retired from the position. So I'm really excited to be engaged with the center in this way. I've been at the School of Natural Resources here at University of Missouri for 10 years with a background in research in silviculture, fire ecology, restoration, and conservation of ecosystems. I'm really excited to be engaged with the center. I've worked with the center in some different ways over the years, but to be stepping into this position is a real honor. Some folks may be familiar with the Center for Agroforestry, others maybe not so much. It was established in 1998 and has since become a national and international leader in temperate agroforestry science and practice. And there's a lot of different facets that the center addresses or covers through research and focus on economic development, education, outreach. The center seeks to provide solutions to a lot of our most challenging problems today. And that includes climate change, natural resource degradation, loss of biodiversity, and food security and economic security as well. The center focuses and talks about multifunctional landscapes in agriculture and how these can provide a variety of ecosystem services that ultimately improve human health and well-being, and through efforts at the center address issues with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. In 2010, the center started with the inaugural Agroforestry Research Symposium, and have had a symposium each year since, making this the 14th annual symposium. This is the third to be virtual, and this provides an opportunity to really connect to a lot of people in different places. The objectives for the symposium include a number of things, but one of the real important things is the ability for individuals to meet and connect, developing meaningful partnerships for others within the agroforestry community. This also connects practitioners to the science and researchers, so we can really kind of see the breadth that that community takes. And we can all broaden our perspectives by looking at and learning about different aspects under the umbrella of agroforestry. Each of the symposia have had a research theme, or a topic that gets highlighted with information that we kind of dive into with more detail. And in the past, we've had research themes on biofuels, soil health and cropping systems, the role of agroforestry and climate smart agriculture, and many other things. And this year, our theme is perennial plants, demystifying perennial crop improvement and integration. So we're really excited for the lineup. We have a number of experts from different parts of the country working with different species, chestnut, elderberry, looking at ways to develop or domesticate herbaceous perennial plants as well. And really excited to bring both a research aspect and a production or practitioner side for different perspectives into the symposium today. We're also very pleased to be working with the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute, and we're going to be hearing some more about that from our next presenter, Dr. Allison Miller. So at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Miller and provide some opportunity for her to talk about that initiative. Dr. Miller is a member and principal investigator with the Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis, as well as a professor in the Department of Biology at St. Louis University. She is the director for the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute, and has a background in botany and a PhD in ecology, evolution, and population biology from Washington U. Her research focuses on perennial plant biology, diversity, and evolution, and uses a wide range of research approaches, including field studies, genetics, and statistical modeling. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Miller. Thank you, and welcome everybody to the symposium.
Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to be here at the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry Annual Symposium. Hannah, thank you for the amazing setup here and introduction, and thanks to everybody who's worked to put this together. I've been associated with the Center for Agroforestry for many years, and I'm just delighted to see the focus today, demystifying perennial crop improvement and integration. So just a quick word of introduction. As it was stated, I'm a professor here at St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri, and a principal investigator at the Danforth Plant Science Center. And since my graduate school, I have been working with perennial crops in one way or another. Today, I'd like to talk about a new initiative, though, called the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute. This is an institute that Sarah Lovell, the former director of the Center for Agroforestry, was heavily involved in at the beginning. And we're working with many folks at the Center for Agroforestry now, including Hannah. So New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute, what we're trying to do is to integrate plant traits, communities, and the soil ecosphere to advance restoration of both natural and agricultural systems. And one of the key points of this Integration Institute is that we've brought together researchers who are interested in restoration, both in nature, as well as using agricultural systems to attempt to restore landscapes and mitigate changing climates. So what is a Biology Integration Institute? This is an NSF initiative. So this is funded by the National Science Foundation. And the goal of these integration institutes, there are about 10 around the US right now, are to support diverse collaborative teams to perform research, education, and training on critical questions that span multiple disciplines within and beyond biology. So our institute includes 9 different institutions. So St. Louis University and the Danforth Plant Science Center, University of Kansas, Chicago Botanic Garden, the Land Institute, Missouri Botanical Garden, St. Louis Science Center, University of Missouri, and the University of Vermont. And the critical question that we're asking within the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute, the main problem is that through their root systems, plants connect above ground components of terrestrial ecosystems to the soil, yet we lack a basic understanding of how plant traits from shoots to roots govern these connections. And it's really incredible when we think about long-lived plants, perennial plants, which have half of their bodies above ground and half of their bodies below ground for multiple years, how it is that they are able to survive and how they're impacted by their environments and how they are in fact impacting the environments around them. So perennial plants do not occur in isolation. Of course, no plants do, nor do any people. They occur in systems. And what the Biology Integration Institute is focused on is thinking about plant traits in the context of their communities and their soil ecosphere. So when we look at a natural community like this breathtaking prairie in Salina, Kansas, what we see are long-lived plants growing together in mixtures. And it's this diversity and perenniality, which is the backdrop in which we want to understand plant traits over space and over time. It's important to think about plant traits and plant form and function in the context of their communities, particularly when we think about restoration. So when we consider restoration of wild landscapes, we can imagine how we might want to identify traits within plants to optimize restoration of these and reconstruction of natural systems. And it's really no different when we think about reimagining agricultural systems that might mimic nature. Perennial polycultures that might mimic the perenniality and diversity of natural systems. And what we'll be talking about, what I'll be sharing today, and what I think you'll hear about in this symposium as well, is the use of intermediate wheatgrass or kernza in polycultures with things like alfalfa and other species. So this Biology Integration Institute, which is called New Roots for Restoration, really bridges together and integrates 3 scientific themes: plant organismal systems, population and community ecology, and the soil ecosphere. And just a broad overview of the science of this institute. In terms of plant organismal systems, we've designed a series of projects to understand how plant root and shoot traits co-vary across different species in 3 major plant families: grasses, legumes, and sunflowers. Our second theme reaches into population and community ecology, where we're studying how above and below ground trait variation predicts and responds to plant community composition. And then third, we're looking at the soil ecosphere, the biotic and abiotic components of the soil, and asking, does the soil and soil microbiome mediate root and shoot variation and covariation, as well as population and species level interactions? So again, this Integration Institute is bringing together these 3 different biological disciplines and attempting to ask questions at their intersection that might help us understand and advance restoration, both in nature and in agriculture. So one of the unique hallmarks of this institute is that we have developed expertise cores. These are groups of scientists with deep knowledge in a particular component of biology that's relevant for the work of the Institute. So we have folks like Abby shown here on the left, who is developing an app and an approach for automated above ground plant phenotyping. Similarly, we're developing new approaches for looking at plant root systems, the below ground components of the plant. We're using an elemental profiling pipeline that quantifies concentrations of 20 different ions in different parts of the plant body. We have a microbiome characterization expertise core, a soil structure and composition core, a core focused on multi-site field logistics, a data science and analysis core, and a core focused on synthesis and integration. So as I said, we've developed 10 different projects that are designed to integrate these different aspects of biology in different ways. Today, I just wanted to highlight one of those 10 projects, and it's a project we call 2.3. This project is asking the question, do root and shoot plant traits vary in monocultures versus polycultures of perennial herbaceous species? And does this variation in plant traits predict production? Further, does it change with the addition of a tree species? So across the Institute, we've set up experiments at 6 sites across the Institute. So at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, at the Danforth Center's Field Research Site here in St. Louis, at the University of Missouri, the University of Kansas, the University of Vermont, and at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And in each of these sites, we've set up an experiment that has intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza and alfalfa. The experimental design here is that we have Kernza growing by itself, alfalfa growing by itself, Kernza growing by itself with fertilizer amendments, and then a Kernza alfalfa biculture. That set of 4 is replicated 4 times. And at the University of Missouri, this whole set of 16 plots is replicated with the addition of a tree, because we're curious how the presence of a tree impacts plant root and shoot traits, and again, how that trait covariation ultimately impacts yield. All right, so the long-term goal here of the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute is to bring together these 3 primary disciplines within biology to understand how plant traits impact and are impacted by their communities, the plants around them, and the soil. Related goals are to bridge researchers from different disciplines, different types of institutions, different parts of the country, not unlike what's happening here at the Center for Agroforestry, to help people understand how to work together, how to speak different scientific languages, and how to build integrative projects that allow us to advance restoration in different contexts. We're also very interested in bridging science in natural landscapes with that in agricultural landscapes. Some of our other projects, which I didn't go into detail on, are focused primarily on wild species. Another major outcome of this institute is that we're really trying to recruit and train and retain and ultimately place trainees from different disciplines in the field of restoration, both in natural systems and agricultural systems. We're working to help scientists learn different types of skills and be able to work in different contexts. We're also working to recruit diverse folks from diverse backgrounds so that we can diversify the cadre of students and investigators who are working to try to remediate our landscapes. And we do this by coming together almost weekly in a virtual sense, in a virtual workspace via Slack and through annual meetings as shown here last May. So I'd be happy to take any questions in the chat, or feel free to contact me directly to learn more about the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute. We're in our 15th month now, and we're in the phase of launching projects and recruiting students and collecting tons of data. So I'd be happy to talk more about that. But what I'd like to do now is to move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Nick Jordan from the University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative. Nick is going to talk about Forever Green's theory of scaling, but I wanted to provide a proper introduction. So Nick is a professor of agronomy and plant genetics at University of Minnesota, where he conducts research on agricultural ecology and agroecosystems. Current research projects focus on agroecology and multifunctional agriculture and address grazing systems, perennial biomass production systems, and innovation in scaling processes in agriculture. He co-directs the Forever Green Initiative. The initiative is developing and commercializing a set of new crops that advance forever green agriculture, continuous living cover of farmland with living plants present all year round. The initiative integrates and leverages collaborations and networks built over decades that span public, private, and NGO sectors with a shared goal of building sustainable food, water, and energy systems from Forever Green. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Nick. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Also, thank you for your fascinating talk. Is everybody able to hear me?
You sound great.
Good. I'm going to share my screen. So I have made a little alteration of the title just to emphasize that this is one theory of scaling for perennial crops, you know, as if we know how to scale up perennial agriculture. And so I want to emphasize in humility that the Forever Green Project is intensely interested in scaling perennial crops, but hardly knows how to do it. However, there are some things that that sort of add up to a strategy that we're carrying out, or what we can call a theory of scaling. And that is what I want to give you a feeling for, or try to, in my presentation. So here is the ground that I would like us to cover. First of all, I want to start with some perspectives on what we even mean by scaling and innovation. These are concepts that are you know, often, very often talked about, but I think that shared understanding of what these terms even mean is generally lacking. So after laying out for you a few introductory concepts that are, you know, essentially key premises about scaling, I want to then move on to presenting one theory of scaling, again, drawing, as Allison was implying, on the experience of this thing called the Forever Green Initiative and a broader group called the Forever Green Partnership. And then I hope we'll have some time for some discussion. So let's just talk about some fundamentals about these ideas of scaling and innovation. So, you know, the visual is of the ascent of a mountain towards a big, hairy, audacious goal. That's what BHAG stands for, is just meant to sort of draw our attention to scaling as this kind of difficult ascent from something being minor to it having more major impact. And scaling has become, a more active field of inquiry in addition to just activity. In other words, the question of how we scale, what we mean by scale, how we scale, for example, with equity and integrity and justice and inclusion, as opposed to just getting things out in the world. Those kinds of questions are being asked more and more. Some folks speak of an emerging science of scaling, and I liked this little visual that you're looking at, because it does highlight how folks that are working in the global South has been particularly important in developing ideas about scaling. So scaling, as I said, can be kind of an obscure thing that isn't necessarily thought about as deeply as we might hope. So this little schematic diagram here is from the work of a guy named Siep Wigboldus, who's a Dutch guy, and a couple of his collaborators at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'll be highlighting some key academic work in this presentation. And Hannah and organizers, I would be happy to make these slides available so anyone can follow up on these references. But I would, the title of this work by Wigboldus and Company, A Framework for Responsible Scaling of Agricultural Innovations, really does point out that this so-called science of scaling is gaining a lot of momentum. So anyhow, this little schematic from Wigboldus and Company highlights, or rather I have highlighted, the way that the scaling process itself is often just sort of black boxed. So let's think about what needs to go on as innovations scale, innovations such as perennial crops, innovations such as perennial agriculture. Oops, sorry. So let's look at three kind of key notions about scaling. So first of all, there is a tendency, I think, to talk about the scaling of innovations. But the reality is that what actually scales up and makes an impact in the world is an innovation, a technical innovation, for example, the perennial crop Kernza, and what we can call co-innovations, other innovations that are often social, organizational, having to do with the way that society functions, essentially. It's actually, there's a lot of evidence from innovation and scaling studies that what actually scales up are what we can think of as these bundles of co-innovation. And so, this quote here, I think, is very much on point here. So for a technical innovation like a Kernza to scale, there needs to be this conducive environment and a set of conducive factors. And if these factors are not available, then they need to either be brought in from somewhere else or they need to be innovated themselves. And I do want to highlight the concept of innovation that I think of as the contemporary idea of innovation. And that is that innovations that actually have an impact in the world are, as these Dutch folks, Lewis and Arts, say, new successful combinations of hardware, software, and orgware. So highlighting that what scales are combinations of innovations or co-innovations. And their terminology is interesting. By hardware, they mean some technical innovation, say, again, a crop like Kernza. By software, they mean essentially knowledge, human capital, understanding of how to make a crop function agronomically, economically, socially. And what they mean by orgware is new relationships, new institutions, in the broad sense of an institution is just a set of people that are working together for some common purpose. So, great example of this from the work of a French guy, Menard and colleagues, is this little diagram that points out they were not actually writing about Kernza, but their analysis is completely applicable to Kernza. So what they point out is that there are all these kinds of barriers. These are noted in the center of this figure here. So just across the board, there are barriers, impediments, limitations at the level of developing the germplasm of these crops, at the level of the agronomy and agroecology, at the level of supply chain and value added economic activity, right on down to people who don't necessarily know what to do with new foods, new crops. And so they point out that to really scale something like Kernza, you don't need just Kernza, you don't need just innovation in Kernza, but a whole sweep of innovation in breeding, in the agronomy and agroecology, et cetera. You also need coordinating institutions. So they point out the problem of lack of coordination between folks involved in this whole system that needs to come together to scale something like Kernza, and the crucial role of new institutions that can coordinate folks, particularly when a new crop is just launching, when there's so much uncertainty, so much risk. And so there's a lot of barriers to coordinating. Okay, notion 2 is that this co-innovation process, which I'm arguing is really the essence of what people call innovation, is actually integral with scaling. So this is again from the work of C. Wigboldus. The sort of prevalent mental model, if you will, of scaling is, I dare say, particularly in the US, is that innovation and scaling are rather separate. So there's a process of R&D that we can call finding out what works. And when we find innovations that work, quote unquote, it is a matter of extending them, transferring them through technology transfer, diffusing them, facilitating their adoption. And we just do more and more and more of that. And that's what we call scaling. They argue instead that actually innovation and scaling have to be seen as a single process. And the real reason for this is because what actually scales are these bundles, right, of something like Kernza plus other things. And the critical thing is the co-innovations. The other things are context specific. And furthermore, so as a crop like Kernza is grown, for example, in lots of different cultures, as we can imagine that occurring, there will need to be different kinds of institutions that are involved in scaling because those are very culturally bound, right? And so the general idea here is that innovation and scaling really should be thought of as a single integrated process. Okay, the third and final notion here is that scaling has an inherent ethical dimension. And that is that scaling must be responsible. And essentially, this is attending to the inevitable reality that there will be winners and losers in scaling, and also unintended consequences. And so I would submit to us that any scaling process that is worthy of perennial agriculture must have a responsibility dimension. There's been a lot of work lately to try to identify a sort of working framework for so-called responsible innovation and scaling. The hallmarks are inclusivity of people that can be affected by the innovation regardless of their social status in the current world. An emphasis on looking forward, on being anticipatory, an emphasis on being reflexive. In other words, considering always what are we taking for granted as we go forward in scaling, what are we overlooking? And finally, a commitment to being responsive. So when there's an indication that the scaling and innovation process needs to change, there's a commitment to actually changing. So I want to highlight, and I don't know if Tessa Peters or my other friends and colleagues at the Land Institute are listening, but I want to tip my hat to them around the Land Institute program in crop stewardship, which I believe is led by Tessa Peters. And this, I would argue, is a great example of co-innovation in order to scale up Kernza perennial grain. And I would also argue that this is a social or organizational innovation orgware, if you will. And the point of crop stewardship is essentially to be responsible as the perennial crops that the Land Institute develops and scales go forward. So note the concern that is highlighted in the green box there around sustainability and justice in the development of new supply chains, partnerships, economies around Kernza and other perennial crops. So the stance of responsibility is I think the third leg of the table of innovation and scaling. There's a lot of innovation going that is underway related to this idea of responsible innovation, the idea of steward ownership, the idea that something like Kernza, which has intellectual property that can be owned associated with it in our current world, the idea that that could be owned in what's a way that is known as steward ownership, that, you know, in a nutshell involves responsibility. The idea of developing things called perpetual purpose trusts, which are basically a legal mechanism to support steward ownership. These are all innovations that are co-innovations, if you will, that I would argue are what need to be bundled together with perennial crops in order to scale them effectively and ethically, responsibly, with integrity. Okay, so those are all some key premises around scaling and innovation that I think are important to as foundational ideas for our efforts to work together to scale perennial agriculture. Now, let me shift to talking to you about the scaling theory that Forever Green is trying to develop and trying to use. And I want to emphasize this is a work in progress, and we are making it up as we go along, and we are figuring out how to apply it and apply it better as we go along. So I want to be sure that to say how much this is a work in progress, but we think it's really valuable to have an underlying theory of change or strategy of scaling. So, brief introduction to the Forever Green Partnership beyond what Allison shared earlier. The partnership specifically is a public-private NGO partnership that has shared interests in continuous living cover agriculture and is working together to scale them up. And just to define that term, continuous living cover agriculture, so we know what we're talking about. This is a concept of agriculture that includes perennial crops, but also includes other things. The point is to cover farmland with living crops over as much of the annual cycle and as much of the farm landscape as possible. So agroforestry is very much part of continuous living cover, very much part of what Forever Green is concerned with, but not the only thing. Okay, so Forever Green is essentially developing a whole portfolio of new winter annual and perennial crops that are that can contribute to the development of continuous living cover in the Midwest of the US and elsewhere. The point is that these crops offer new products that the world wants and needs. These create new opportunities that are economic for growers of these crops and the rest of agriculture to profit from the growth of these crops. And it also provides both a way to produce ecosystem services and a way to essentially reduce the cost of providing ecosystem services such as climate adaptation at scale to society. Forever Green is working on a whole bundle of crops, at least 15 of these. Each of these has a group of researchers and commercializers. Well, researchers in all cases, commercializers for the ones that are closest to being market ready. And I just want you to see that there are lots of perennial crops. The portfolio is mostly perennial crops between the herbaceous and woody ones, but also includes some annual crops. So let's talk about this theory of scaling of Forever Green. So a very key point is, I'm sure we're all actually subliminally or very acutely aware, is that any new crop has to cross what in the world of innovation is called the Valley of Death. And the point of the Valley of Death is that there are all kinds of good ideas out there. There are all kinds of good ideas that someone is willing to buy at some scale, but actually moving new innovations out into the world of markets and commerce at any kind of scale is likely to be highly unprofitable as you scale up, and that there's a valley of death of economic viability that has to be crossed. And if this valley is deep or wide, it makes it almost impossible to cross. So essentially, our theory of scaling is trying to help new perennial crops cross this valley of death by making it as shallow and narrow as we can, essentially. So to explain our scaling theory in Forever Green, I want to again kind of step back and kind of talk conceptually to share with you some other, I think, really important ideas about scaling. Melinda. Sorry, there was a hand raised. Melinda, would you want to say what's on your mind?
We'll save questions for when you're finished. And just a reminder to folks to use that Q&A feature to add your questions for now.
Thank you, Hannah, for keeping those Himmelgarns under control. Okay, so here's what I want to share with you. There is quite a bit of evidence for the process that is depicted in that little diagram there, which I want to explain to you. The important idea is that it takes multi-sector, multi-scale networks to actually achieve transformational change in major societal life support systems, such as agriculture. And I guess I'm going to ignore these raised hands for the moment. Hannah, let me know if there's something I need to respond to, okay? So, okay. So the point that I want to express to you is that there's a lot of evidence from the history of change, transformational change in energy systems, water systems, transportation systems, that it's very hard to make transformational change in these systems. That these systems are ordinarily provided to society by systems that we can call regimes that provide, say, transportation fuel to society. There's a whole interlocking set of elements: science, culture, investments, policy, skills, consumer preferences, that all reinforce each other and keep a particular regime in place. And this regime is constantly, sort of under critique from people that don't like it for one reason or another. And these folks are constantly working in marginal situations in what is referred to as a niche in this terminology, to come up with something better. But ordinarily, the regime, and for our purposes, let's talk about annual agriculture as a regime, as opposed to perennial agriculture. The regime is, generally speaking, very effective at keeping niche innovation, let's call it perennial crops, from actually scaling up through all kinds of ways of blocking that. However, it happens sometimes that the surrounding world becomes dissatisfied with the regime. And so, for example, the surrounding world is perceiving annual agriculture in its industrialized conventional form to be a problem with regard to climate change, right? And so the world is starting to put pressure of various sorts on industrialized annual agriculture to change. And the theory, which is called the multi-level perspective here, says to us, that major systems such as agriculture transform when pressure that we can call top-down, coming from that so-called landscape level, the surrounding world. That does not mean a biophysical landscape, that means the economic, political, cultural, etc. landscape. When top-down pressure and bottom-up pressure, in other words, the availability of some alternative that would actually work to the regime, coincide. That's when systems transformation occurs at scale, and otherwise not. That's what this theory says. So the implication of that is that a strategy for scaling up new crops is to essentially coordinate top-down and bottom-up forces. So here I've put in some of the players in this kind of dynamic. So the landscape is represented by what? Regulators, media, influential NGOs, investors. These are all the kind of folks that are increasingly unhappy with our current conventional annual agriculture because of, say, its involvement in climate change. Food companies are, not the whole of the regime that we can speak of, quote unquote, but they're important to it. And the players that are down in niches are all kinds of folks that are putting together innovations such as, say, crop stewardship, and also just developing crops and all kinds of trying them out in practice, etc. These are the niche innovators. So what we try to do in Forever Green is to work both to coordinate top-down forces and to coordinate bottom-up forces in pursuit of transformative change towards continuous living cover, which, as you've seen, in our case, includes lots of perennial crops. So we can speak of so-called top-down work that's done to pursue our strategy. Essentially, top-down work is trying to build support for CLC agriculture from powerful institutions. I've listed them on this slide: NGOs, regulators, etc. The point being to put pressure on the existing regime to change. This pressure can be incentives, such as, for example, the massive financial incentive around so-called climate smart agriculture that the US federal government has recently put out, but it can be other kinds of pressures as well. So various kinds of top-down work include policy ideations. Here's a paper published by, among other folks, Sarah Taylor Lovell, and the aforementioned Tessa Peters and others. Another kind of top-down work is what we call co-creative politics. This is essentially working across lines of difference to find common ground for cooperation in what we can call constructive collective action. For example, to coordinate top-down pressure on regimes. Strategic communications, so developing of narratives, working with media, another very important form of top-down work that we're involved in. And finally, finance and capital innovations are crucially important. There's an enormous amount of financial capital in the hands of relatively few people in the world that we live in right now. Lots of those people actually do have intentions to invest this capital in ways that address the grand challenges of climate, agriculture, and environment. And there's a lot of innovation out there in finance, essentially. And so an important part of top-down work is working with innovators in those fields. So that's top-down work. It's very important to what we do in Forever Green. There's also what we could call bottom-up work. And this is essentially this matter of bundling together co-innovations. If what really scales are, in fact, bundles of innovations, not just perennial crops by themselves. And if those bundles have to be sort of figured out in a learn by doing way, you build a bundle, you put it out there, you learn from that, so that innovation and scaling are in fact one process, not separate processes. And if in fact we have to figure out if we're being responsible as we go along, then we need to spend a lot of time trying to build co-innovations, get them out at pilot scales, see how they work, see if we're being responsible, et cetera. So let's talk a little bit about that, that bottom-up work, and then I'm getting close to the end of what I wanted to share with you. So this, this building of co-innovations, scaling them up, learning, et cetera, requires a few things that we can identify. Obviously, there has to be the basic hardware, if you will, the basic technical innovation, perennial crops that are decently well developed. We need also the base of a supply chain that's growing the crops, and the rest of the supply chains that we have to have figured out how these work. And we also have to be attent to equity and inclusion in building these. And then finally, there have to be end use markets. So if you have those three things, a crop, some kind of rudimentary way to get it to market, and demand, in other words, supply and demand in a supply chain, then you have the ingredients of a bundle of co-innovations that you can then put out to the world. But we know from the study of scaling that there are a lot of other scaling factors that are crucial. And I mentioned this before, and it sort of relates to the bundling, but it also relates to the sort of environment in which this scaling process goes forward. So there has to be capital available on decent terms to pilot any kind of perennial crop and its supply chain. Supportive policy is very important. Trusting relationships that will enable people to cooperate in a risky situation are very important. And having sort of some shared strategy for going forward is very important. And the bottom three there, trust, cooperation, and defined strategies, it's sort of duh, of course you need those things, but I'm sure that everyone in this webinar is aware how difficult and how time consuming it is, in fact, to build those things. So the bottom up work, the essence of it is building these co-innovations in niches. And I do want to give a shout out to the many colleagues that I work with who are involved as intermediaries, who are essentially trying to build the collaborative, trusting, ongoing relationships that are necessary to co-innovate and scale things at pilot scales. Okay, I want to kind of culminate here by showing you a diagram that I think is very, very helpful for us. So this illustrates a system, a process of building and scaling at pilot scale supply chain projects for perennial crops. And it makes some very important points here. So one is that we're bundling together crops and other innovations, as you see up at the top there, the top right-hand quadrant of this diagram. So the hardware, the software, the orgware, if you will. We are bundling these with, if they're not innovations, they are just sort of supportive interventions, such as finance, such as building trust. And we are putting these puzzle pieces together into co-innovation bundles. That's what the completed puzzles represent. And the point is that they're different because different crops, and in the same crop in a different situation, is likely going to require a different bundle of co-innovations. So we build these, we put these out in the world, we see how they do on KPMs, that's key performance measures, including, for example, equitable, to ask if we're being responsible here. We learn from that, we keep this cycle going. So this is meant to be a learning process by which we build increasingly viable forms of perennial agriculture, perennial crops that can be available for widespread scaling when there is enough pressure on existing regimes, current agriculture, current annual dominated agriculture, that it is motivated or is being forced to change. So in the Forever Green initiative, we have many pilot supply chain projects that are all based on what we call crop clusters, groups of farms that are growing a single crop. We find that these are very generative. They incentivize folks at in-use markets and in supply chains to co-innovate. They incentivize investors. And so this strategy of pilot supply chain projects, which are basically the little multicolored completed puzzles that you see down at the bottom right-hand corner of this figure, that's what I'm talking about. One, I want to say just a little bit more about one particular pilot supply chain project that is gestating. So it is very much based on a crop stewardship concept of ownership of the genetics by one of these perpetual purpose trusts that I mentioned. It has an innovative, makes use of an innovative concept called the mother-baby structure, in which we have a central farm in which more intensive piloting and research are being done, and a set of baby farms, if you will, where simpler kinds of piloting are done. There's intensive investment in technical assistance, but also in support for farmer innovation and learning. There is co-innovation around mechanizing the production of this particular crop, planting and harvesting. There is finance and land access co-innovation going on. There is an intervention of capital to build a shared post-harvest infrastructure. So these are some of the things that go into these pilot supply chains that we and our collaborators, Forever Green is just really a node in a larger network, many parts of which are represented in this webinar. But this is how we try to work. Okay, just about done here. A really important question, I think, is how the kind of system, the kind of learning, dynamic learning process of co-innovation, pilot scaling, further innovation, further bundling, further pilot scaling, etc., ideally attracting more and more transformation accelerators. That's a way of saying basically more and more investment from society. Sorry about that. No, I seem to have been bounced out of there we go. How do we make this a system? How do we build, it's making something like this work one-off is very, very expensive. How do we build a system that does this efficiently? The drives, as it says over there, drives this dynamic process in a way that's effective, efficient, and ethical. That is, I think, a really critical question for scaling perennial agriculture, and it's one that we're directly addressing in Forever Green at the moment. So, to recap real quick, Our strategy of scaling these is from a 10,000 foot view is based on this idea that by coordinating top down and bottom up forces, you can orchestrate essentially those otherwise rare moments when regimes are either forced to or incentivized to change. And that building a system in particular to drive the bottom up work of co-innovation, coupled co-innovation and scaling, I think is a really, really key opportunity for us. How do we build a system that does that? Okay, that's it. And Hannah, I guess we've got, and everyone else, I guess we've got 10 minutes or so to chew the fat before we need to wind things up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick Jordan and Dr. Alison Miller, both of you, for sharing your important insights on this. And we have some really great questions coming in, definitely some fat to chew. So, you bring up ethics, the importance of that component here. And I think one of the early questions that has come in and multiple people have brought up is the role of trademarking and intellectual property in all of this. We are, of course, deeply embedded in capitalism, and there are so many ways that can affect this scaling process, as you have raised. So one question that was raised here in the Q&A, do you have any information on the scalability of plans with registered trademarks versus open sourced? This person is suggesting that, it seems like those without that intellectual property limitation would potentially scale faster. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just respond briefly. Is Tessa Peters with us?
She is, and she should be able to pop in.
Yep,
Okay.
I'm here.
Tessa, do you want to reply to that?
Yeah, sure. Of course, the Land Institute owns the trademark on Kernza, and it is possible that we could get more acres of Kernza on the land more quickly if we didn't have the trademark. But I think that scaling isn't just about the number of acres, it's also about the market and the supply chain being in place. And so we've sort of purposely kept the reins on with Kernza because we want to make sure that the market and the supply chain are stable and in place so that the price doesn't just immediately drop because of a glut of supply on growers. And so that balancing act or razor's edge is sort of where we live in this place. And the trademark has actually provided us a really unique way to build boundaries around how people interact with Kernza as a common good. And so, if we look at sort of on the theoretical side of how common spaces or common resources are shared, it's really important for them to have boundaries and understanding of those boundaries be shared by the stakeholders. And Kernza, having the trademark in place has actually provided us a really good opportunity to develop those kind of boundaries and to encourage, growers to work together so that growers who have higher yields in one geography aren't undercutting the price of growers in other areas, and encourage supply chain actors to be more transparent with their supply and with their supply, both supply and demand. And so the trademark, I think, while we might have been able to sort of like release it willy-nilly, has allowed us to do some really unique and innovative things in terms of the governance systems, which Nick was talking about. So
Thanks a lot, Tessa. That's a much better answer than I could have given.
Nick, or Tessa, if you have any other thoughts on the sort of pros and cons of trademarking, in addition to what you shared, Tessa, that would be welcome. But that was That was wonderful, Tessa. Thank you.
Sure. I can throw a few more thoughts in the chat, and that way, if there are other questions, those can,
Sure.
or in the Q&A, and if there are other questions, those can be answered too.
That sounds great. Yeah, another one here from Elaine. How do you envision scaling crops on an international level? For example, collaborating with other countries and collaborating on research.
Well, first of all, I think that the idea that what scales are bundles of co-innovations, and that innovation and scaling are in fact just one process, really underscores the fact that, say, Kernza, in, I don't know, what would be some relevant geography, say, on the plains of, a place like Ukraine, there would need to be some, the co-innovations would be specific to the biophysical and cultural and economic and so on environment of that place. And the process of bundling co-innovations and putting them out to see how they do, in other words, coupled innovation scaling, that would have to be done by local actors. So in other words, that thing that I was pointing to at the end of my talk, this idea of building robust systems that can drive the co-innovation and scaling process, that would need to be done. That stuff would need to be present in any place that a crop that had been developed in one place was being scaled someplace else. So it just points out the importance of the agency and the importance of the capacity and agency of the people of the place where any sort of international work is being done. I guess I don't have any more to say about it than that.
Yeah, and I think some of that will also be addressed in the session after the break at 1:30. So for anyone interested in that topic, please stick around 1:30 Central Time for the presenters who will be sharing then. Yeah, there are a couple questions that have come in about access to capital or other resources for those who are interested in being part of this.
Well, access to capital is, I think, a matter of working with finance innovators and finance institutions that are, so I would specifically mention the work of the Croatan Institute, and I have great respect for work that colleagues there are doing to develop, for example, the basic issue is how do you bring capital to risky, uncertain, and slowly developing things like, at this point, perennial agriculture at scale. And you need, new forms of capital, essentially, and new institutions to provide those. So those of us who are basically rooted in production agriculture and associated agricultural science, that's not our world, right? So we have to connect with those innovators, those institutions. They're definitely out there. So, for example, the pilot supply chain projects that we're involved with in Forever Green, they pretty much all have some source of capital that is, available on workable terms to support the co-innovation and scaling.
So connected to that question, then, someone else has asked about public funding versus private funding. and what is or could be the role of the Farm Bill in developing perennial cropping system or supporting the scaling process.
Mhm. Well, I think that obviously we make massive public investments in agriculture. And so um, if those, this is a classic thing that a well-established regime does, is that it attracts and tenaciously holds onto public investment. And so, it is necessary to, this is so, and it's going to keep doing that until there is intensive pressure to change. We're already seeing those pressures on crop insurance, right? And we're also seeing those pressures on this idea of reporting climate change vulnerabilities. The Securities and Exchange Commission, and conventional agriculture is quite opposed to that. And so you see the resistance, right? And so it's necessary. Crop insurance, for example, is a major form of public financing of our agriculture. And so, there's not going to be a major change in the crop insurance situation until there's more pressure on the current system than there is now. But you see that pressure building. So I think public financing is essential. However, there's this immense amount of capital, right, in the hands of relatively few people, and many of them want to invest, in a better future. And so it's really critical to engage with that capital, I think, also.
All right. I think so many of these questions, it can become really sticky, and I'm so glad that they're coming up. I really like what Samantha Basco shared in the chat. May the equitable scaling of agroforestry build a mountain of life over that deep, dark valley.
I love that.
Yeah. We exist in these systems, and I think resisting them has to exist alongside accommodating them in some ways, but I hope that there's space for all of that to happen. Please feel free to continue adding your questions in the Q&A. If we don't have time to answer them all, that's fine. We'll continue to try to answer them in that space. Eli posted, why is it that perennial crops must be viable in markets? This is related to these big questions. While currently commodity crops are heavily subsidized and not outcompeting due to the market forces, but due to propping up directly through subsidies used to destabilize economies elsewhere in the world by dumping surpluses. There's so much wrapped up in this. So if you have other thoughts on that, what is there, maybe, could we think of examples where scaling has happened really more from bottom up than from top down, and where, the top down has to meet the bottom up because of that pressure?
Well, I think it's really important, Hannah and everyone else, that the theories that we're guided by in Forever Green are that bottom up and top down are both essential to scaling. And and particularly scaling with integrity. So, meaning justice, inclusion. However, not being overly sort of theory bound is really important. And, that's why I call this one theory of scaling, because this is, a question that those of us who are interested in perennial agriculture have to collectively address, is how do we scale? How do we get better at doing it efficiently and responsibly and ethically?
All right, thank you. And I know, Dr. Jordan, that you are going to have to run to class at this point. There are a couple questions that I think Allison Miller may be well suited to answer. So, Nick, if you need to run, thank you so much for being with us for this session and for your insights. And for folks who are still here, please also post some of your big ideas and resources and big questions on that discussion board in the Padlet space, so we don't lose track of this. All of that will be archived with the symposium recordings. So we want to have that as a sort of collective notes for the day. Okay, a question for you, Dr.
Super.
Miller.
Many thanks. Have a
Thank
great
you
rest
so much.
of webinar, everyone.
Have a wonderful day.
Bye. Thank you.
How does Kernza fit with agroforestry?
Well, Kernza intermediate wheatgrass, as we just have been hearing, is the perennial herbaceous crop that I think is furthest along in the domestication and development process, and also furthest along in terms of its distribution, as we've heard, and probably will hear more from Tessa on this. So as far as how it relates to agroforestry, I think it's one of the go-to systems that we're exploring in a multi-crop agroforestry system. So the project that I described earlier has intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza growing with alfalfa and ultimately with a tree, which someone asked in the chat. Our plan was to use pecan, although that might be changing. So it's one of the systems, it's one of the perennial herbaceous crops that we are experimenting with in a system that includes trees. I don't think it'll be the last one. I don't think it'll be the only one. I think, and I'm sure it's not the only one right now. It's just one that is, it's being used most commonly at the time.
Thank you. Yeah, and as you mentioned, please do stick around. Tessa Peters and Ben Penner, who is a grower of Kernza, will both be starting us off in the next session. And at this point, oh gosh, there's another question popping up. They keep popping up. This is great. But we are going to take a very short bio break before we start the next session. We don't want anyone to get too wrapped up today in screen time. So get a moment of fresh air, take a little break, and then we'll be back here in 4 minutes to start our next session. So thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for your presentation and for your answers.